All right, so this brings us to the last video for our lesson on moral and for moral statement and moral argument, or task 1 of week 5. And it really does help if you did the 2 to 2.5 page reading. You'll get a good feel from what I'm saying, and it'll be easier for you to follow this, so I do hope you've done that. Let's go ahead and start. You might want to write at the top of this and also at the top of your other notes that you need to refer to these documents. You could write that up here throughout the entire semester. So we're going to create a little diagram, kind of almost like a flow chart of checks that we're going to use to analyze these arguments in light of what we learned in the last 2 lessons. Let's title our little flow chart / diagram as the I keep forgetting that the marker has run out. The necessary ingredients of a properly constructed I'm going to have to abbreviate this argument. So what we're about to draw a diagram for is the necessary ingredients of a properly constructed argument. So we're going to create 3 columns. I'd say, just in case, leave about 1 inch to 1.5 inches right here. Okay. And then at the very top, you're going to write check 1. Check number 1. Then a couple spaces over at the very top, we're doing a second column, and we're going to call that check number 2. And then leave about 1 inch of space, maybe a little bit more, maybe 1.5 inches, and write check, actually about right here, check number 3. It's supposed to say check. All right, so basically what we have going on is 3 columns, but I don't want to draw lines because we're going to draw arrows going this way. Okay, so notice that this says necessary. This doesn't mean sufficient. So what we're going to list here are things that an argument must have, or a passage must have, to properly be identified as a moral argument. Now that's not all, as we'll learn in context that there are other things that need to be true of an argument for it to be a properly constructed moral argument. And then actually, I should have said moral argument. Sorry guys, I've been up since 3:30 with my emergency. So the necessary ingredients of a properly constructed moral argument. A lot of the arguments that we've looked at this semester are not moral, but they're still properly constructed. So what do we mean by a properly constructed moral argument? Well, there's going to have to be at least 2 premises. So we're going to write there must be at least 2 premises, and this is the way we're going to diagram it. The way to interpret this is what? There must be at least 2 premises and a conclusion. So P is for premise, C is for conclusion. Now, you might want to add over here, draw an arrow as a warning, a tip, do exclamation marks, that there can be more than 2 premises, and there can be 2 conclusions, in the sense that there could be a sub-conclusion and a final conclusion. What we are stating are the minimum requirements. So you might want to also write that down. So you could do an arrow like that and write, focus is on minimum requirements, okay? But again, you could have more than 2 premises and more than 1 conclusion. And you'll understand that more when I say more than 1 conclusion when we get to task 2 of week 5. Okay, so if a passage or argument has at least 2 premises and a conclusion for a total of 3 statements, then it has passed check 1. It is possible that the argument that we are looking at is a moral argument, a properly constructed one. So if you look at arguments 1 and 2, you can see that there are 2 premises and a conclusion. The point of this lesson is not to see whether or not you can analyze a passage and see what are their premises or conclusions. So I've gone ahead and done that. We're focusing on other things. So here we're able to easily check to see if this first check is met, and it does. So we can do check for that. All right, so once we've established that, the next thing that we need to do is check to see that at least one premise is a moral statement and that one premise is a non-moral statement. Oh, by the way, over here, I think you should write these statements can occur in any order. So remember we learned about the argument patterns, PCP, PC, and CP? Well, obviously the same is true whether or not something's a moral argument doesn't matter. But that becomes important when we think about moral statements, non-moral statements, and moral statements as well. So a properly constructed argument, in a properly constructed moral argument, the moral statements and the non-moral statement could come in any order. You could have the moral statement, you could have two moral statements, then a non-moral statement. You could have a moral statement, a non-moral statement, then a moral statement. Or you could have a moral statement, you could have a non-moral statement followed by two moral statements. The point is at least one premise a moral statement, is at least one premise a non-moral statement, and is at least one conclusion a moral statement, okay? But again, these can occur in any order. Another thing you might want to write out, you could write that down here as a warning if you want, right? You could put, there can be more than one moral statement. There can be more than one, there can be more than one premise that is a moral statement. There can be more than one premise that's a non-moral statement. There could be more than one conclusion that's a moral statement. So here we're saying one or more, at least one. Okay? So there could be moral arguments that have 5 premises and a conclusion. Maybe there's one moral statement, 3 non-moral statements, and then the 5th statement's a moral statement as a conclusion. All right, so let's check this. So now we're going to practice applying these definitions using these examples as a guide to identify and label the statements in here. So, relatives feel immense grief when loved ones are killed. Okay, is there any of the moral terminology or phrases that we've learned about? No. It doesn't say it's wrong to feel grief, it's right to feel grief. It doesn't say that killing is wrong. No moral language in here. So this is a non-moral statement. So when we identify a statement as non-moral, we're going to use NMS, non-moral statement, and we'll put it to the left. If the argument is already reformatted or if it's in this form, then we will just put the label right next to premise. So we have a non-moral statement that is the first premise in this particular argument. George Floyd was killed. That actually might be an example somewhere, close to an example, but do we see anybody saying that it was wrong or right to kill anybody or him? Nope. It's just saying this action took place. It asserts that an action took place. It asserts that someone was the recipient of an action, but it does not assign a moral value to that action or anyone. So this is another non-moral statement. All right, so look at our checklist. It says at least one premise must be a moral statement. We already know that this cannot be a what? Properly constructed moral argument because what? Checklist number 2. There are no premises functioning as a moral statement. That's not enough, but it's definitely necessary. And that in and of itself is to rule out that this is a properly constructed moral argument. Now that said, this could be a moral statement. The conclusion could be one. It still wouldn't be a properly constructed moral argument because it would not have a moral premise. So relatives of George Floyd feel immense grief. We'll go ahead and label that just so you can have more examples. So notice that you're also getting examples of terminology that we've used because we're applying the definitions for said terminology. So when something is not a moral argument and I ask you to tell me whether it is or is not, I'm also going to ask you to explain why. And you can explain why in virtue of our checklist. So here you would say in complete sentence, this, or you could say argument 1, is not a properly, I want you to use that word, you'll understand why later, properly constructed moral argument. Now, you have to tell me why. Explain. So you could say because, or really what we're doing is we're offering support for this as a conclusion. So what reason do I have for thinking this is true about this argument? Because what? It fails checklist 2 That's too general. If you give me this answer, you're going to lose points for precision. I need you to go into more detail. You could do a colon. You can say it fails to have a moral premise. That in and of itself is enough. So notice that I elaborate a little bit because there's a lot in checklist 2. You have to tell me in what way does it fail checklist 2. It could have a moral premise, but it doesn't have a moral conclusion. All right, so you would put this in your own words, but you could definitely use this as a kind of template. You can say argument 1 is not a properly constructed moral argument. I've come to the conclusion that the reasoning above is not a properly constructed moral argument. Then you could end the sentence, and then you could start off the reason indicator, the reason being, I think this because, and then you could say, it doesn't meet all the requirements of check 2. It might have 2 premises, but it doesn't have a moral premise. So there's different ways that you can put that. All right, so let's look at argument 2. Okay, 1 should never be overly aggressive. Okay, so notice the word should here. Remember what I said in context? So this word names what is typically a moral concept. And in the context of this argument, we see that it is being used in a moral sense. Sometimes we'd say things like, you should brush your teeth. Well, as you read, should is sometimes used in a prudential sense, not a moral sense. We're not saying it's wrong, it's the morally correct thing to do to brush your teeth. We're just saying it's prudential. It makes good sense too. But here we're using it in the moral sense. And so should is a moral value being assigned to any action that is what? Morally aggressive. Overly. So overly aggressive actions, well, those should never occur. One should never be overly aggressive. Okay, so let's go ahead, or people should never be overly aggressive in their actions is what I should say. So that's being assigned to that. So it's, in other words, it's wrong to be overly aggressive. We have a duty not to be overly aggressive. We have a moral obligation to not be overly aggressive. All right, so that's definitely a moral statement. So I want you to put the MS over here. So MS will mean moral statement. I want you to write it over here because we're going to fill this in. Using a knee to subdue George Floyd was overly aggressive. So this describes the nature of an action, right? You can see that right there. And then this names a particular form of what some people say is overly aggressive, using a knee, right? And this talks about it happening to a particular person, George Floyd. So this is all about particulars, but that doesn't make it a particular moral judgment. In fact, it can't be. Why? Do you see anything about right or wrong or good or bad? Do you see any of those words in here? No. So here we're going to write NMS, non-moral statement. Okay, so let's look at, so far it has what it needs to be a moral argument. It has a premise that's a moral statement, a premise that's a non-moral statement. See that? Is our conclusion a moral statement? A knee should not have been used to subdue George Floyd. Yes, we have the word should, and this time it is talking about what? Some particular person, right, who did get subdued by the knee. That actually happened. In this case, it's in the past, so that we're making a moral judgment about something that happened in the past. This is definitely a moral statement. Okay, so this passes checklist number 2. So far, we are en route to declaring this as a properly constructed moral argument. So now we go to checklist 3. So one of the moral statements must be functioning as a general moral principle. Okay, and that must be the moral premise. When it comes to the non-moral statement, then we're clear. There are no moral requirements. However, when it comes to the conclusion, if it's a properly constructed moral argument, the conclusion will be a moral statement in the form of a particular moral judgment. And again, these don't have to occur in any particular order, right? They could happen in any order in an ordinary argument or passage. Okay, so let's look at this statement. One should never be overly aggressive. Does it say who? What group of people? Does it say what kinds of actions? Or what context or what scenario? No, it's very general. But down here, it talks about certain kind of action being overly aggressive to a particular person, right? And then it has the word should not. So which one is more specific and which one is more general? This is more general. So this is our general moral principle. This is our particular moral judgment. So we're going to use GMP to mean general moral principle and PMJ to mean moral statement. Okay, so that said, I want you to understand that what's happening here, look at premise 1. One should never be overly aggressive. Let's go back to this lesson. Remember we said that general moral principles get applied to non-moral statements. So this general moral principle is like a rule, a general rule. One should never be overly aggressive, right? Gets applied to premise 2, our non-moral statement. Do you see that? So premise 1 gets applied to premise 2, a non-moral statement. So in other words, these two statements work together to advance what? This conclusion. So as you read in the reading, a properly constructed moral argument must have a moral premise working together with a non-moral premise to derive a moral conclusion. To be more specific, a properly constructed moral argument needs both a general moral principle or general moral value to work together along with a non-moral statement to warrant a moral statement that is functioning as a particular moral judgment. So as indicated in the notes for particular moral judgment, the result we get when a general moral principle is applied to a non-moral statement. So here we would write the result we got in applying P1, a general moral principle, to P2, a non-moral statement. Let's just do the diagram for fun so you can see it. I don't want to do a diagram because then you're going to get confused because we have no statement numbers. I mean, we could say that this is S1, S2, S3, so let's just do that. So we have S1, a premise, and actually let's do S1, a moral statement that is a general moral principle in the form of a premise, works together within that's statement 1. So we're just saying S1, S2, S3. Never put S's in here though, I already lectured on that. Joins S2, a non-moral statement, right? They work together jointly to support S3, another moral statement in the form of a particular moral judgment, a conclusion. So this is what the argument structure would look like at a minimum. They're actually much more complex. At a minimum, this is what the structure of a properly constructed moral argument would look like. You'd have at least one statement that's a premise that's functioning as a general moral principle, working together with another statement that's functioning as a non-moral statement. Working together, they attempt to support a third statement or another statement, a particular moral judgment that is a conclusion. Okay. Now the wording in here has to, of course, link up in the right way, right? These things have to have some kind of connection to each other. So this one connects to this and that in what way? Well, this one's talking about overly aggressive and a general rule not to do it, and then it links up to this one because this one's talking about some action being overly aggressive. And then obviously this conclusion connects to these two statements because it's talking about what should or should not happen, and it's talking about the use of what? A knee, so it connects to that one, being applied to George Floyd or being used on George Floyd. So you do have to have, certain content forming in the right way. Okay, so with that said, we have, actually, I'm going to cut this lesson into 2 because I'm trying to keep videos to 20 minutes. We're now going to work with these last 3 arguments, and then I promise we are done with task 1.